Hi, welcome to Recap Nation. Today we are going to recap a 2021 movie called Luca. So, sit back and enjoy. In a small fishing town on the coast of Italy called Portorosso, a preteen sea monster named Luca lives with his family. He always spends his day helping his mother herd a school of fish. His parents, Daniela and Lorenzo, restrict him from going to the surface out of fear, telling him that it is dangerous and can cost him his life. But doing the same thing every day ends up making Luca very bored. Luca was curious about the surface and how it looked, but each time he remembered the words of his parents, he stayed back. Luca takes advantage of the time he spends going out to herd the fish to look for lost objects that come to the surface. One day, as he was looking for a lost object, he saw a man in a diving suit approaching him. He was scared and ran to hide. When the man approached him and opened his face, he realized that the man was not a human, but a young sea monster just like him named Alberto. After a brief introduction, suddenly, Alberto picks up the objects and begs to swim to the nearby island. Luca was so curious to know what Alberto was up to that he followed him. Luca was surprised to see Alberto come out of the water and become a human because he never thought that was possible. When Alberto notices Luca's reaction, he suddenly stretches for his staff and pulls him out so he can look like that too. When Luca comes out of the water for the first time in his entire life, he is dismayed by his new appearance. Alberto tries to explain, but Luca decides to go back into the water and pretend as though nothing has happened. That night, Luca stayed awake, thinking about what had happened. The next morning, he goes to the island by himself and tries to find the courage to come out by himself. While he was hesitating, Alberto arrived. Seeing Alberto go out and be safe, he finds the courage to come out too. Since Luca has been swimming all his life and has never experienced gravity, he finds it difficult to walk. Alberto helped him with tips and tricks on how to walk, and he was able to do so. Alberto has been on land many times and has a hideout on an island near Portorosso, where he claims he lives with his father. He begs Luca to follow him, so the two make their way to Alberto's hideout. As Alberto was showing him human things, Luca saw a poster showing a Vespa, an Italian scooter, which caught his attention. Immediately, the scooter became a dream for the both of them, and because they have no money to buy one for themselves, the two soon decide to make their own from scratch with the garbages they found in the ocean. They finally managed to build it after some hours of work. That day, Luca stayed too long on the surface, so he hurried to reach home. As he reached home, his mother began shouting at him, asking him where he had been. His grandma tries to defend him by saying that she sent him to find sea cucumbers for her. The next day, Alberto and Luca met again to test their new invention. But as Alberto decides to test it running down the hill, the scooter breaks into pieces. He barely scratches himself on the ground but manages to use the ramp and falls into the water. After their first scooter was destroyed, the boys spent more time together trying and improving their scooter, making several attempts and getting closer. On this fateful day, after finishing a scooter, they decide to test the scooter together while a turtle serves as a support for the ramp. They almost crashed on the rocks. Luca's parents, Lorenzo and Daniela, soon began keeping an eye on his movements and discovered that he had been spending more time on the surface. They decided to send him deeper into the ocean to live with his uncle, Hugo, a transparent creature with all his organs visible. Luca, upon hearing this, disagreed and went to Alberto on the surface to inform him about the argument he had with his parents. After talking for a while, Alberto gave them the idea to flee into the main city of Portorosso. They both swim to shore and use a boat to enter the city. As soon as they entered the city, they saw fishermen carrying fish with hooks in their hands. Luca was frightened but was calmed by Alberto. When they reach the city square, they see a man riding a scooter and decide to go talk to him. But a group of children playing football mistakenly play the ball to Luca, expecting him to kick the ball back at them. Luca kicks the ball, but since he has never played a ball before, he eventually knocks the scooter of the man named Ercole. Ercole got furious, and seeing that the people who knocked down his scooter were children, he decided to punish them. He took Lucas in an attempt to deep dive him into the water to reveal his identity, but just as Ercole was about to dunk Lucas' head into a fountain, which would expose his identity as a sea monster, a young girl named Giulia showed up at the last minute and saved his life. Giulia takes Luca and Alberto to safety on her bike. Alberto asked her where Ercole got the scooter, and she told them that he got it from the racing competition. They went ahead and asked her several questions about the competition, which she answered by explaining that triathlon consists of 3 races: swimming laps, eating pasta, and riding a bike through the town. But seeing her zeal to beat Ercole in the competition, Luca has the idea of teaming up with her so that they may win the competition. The two claim that they can't swim, Therefore, Alberto takes up eating pasta, and Luca takes up riding a bike, which forced Giulia to swim. So after forming the team, Giulia takes them to her house, where she lives for the summers with her one-handed father, Massimo, an expert fish hunter seeking to kill a sea monster. Seeing the man's determination to capture sea monsters, Luca got scared and ended up spitting the water from his mount on Alberto's face, revealing his identity. But they quickly went under the table and cleaned the water before anyone noticed. As they were eating dinner that evening, the girl told her father about the team she had formed earlier and asked him for the registration fee. But the father told her that he has not been catching fish lately, so he has no money, so he can't help. Upon hearing this, Luca and Alberto decide to help with the fishing since they know the lives of all the sea creatures in that region. The next morning, as Giulia practiced, the two boys followed Massimo and ended up in a place with practically no fish. After staying for a while, Luca told the fishermen that they were in the fish-hunted graveyard, and fish avoid those areas, so Alberto showed them a perfect spot where fish usually stay. Following their advice, Massimo managed to fill his boat with fish. After fishing, they got the money and went to the cup registration desk. A minute later, Ercole arrives with his gangs and snatches their money. Seeing this, Alberto challenged him to a fight, but Luca and Giulia calmed Alberto down and began insulting Ercole's looks. Ercole feels challenged and returns the money for all of them to register. After a while, the team began to practice. However, over time, Ercole starts to become suspicious of the boys. As Giulia was practicing swimming, Ercole started speeding toward them in an attempt to break their boat. But as they got close, Glitto, one of Ercole's friends, turned the boat to avoid the collision, but the drift their boat made ended up splashing water on Alberto, turning him into a monster. He quickly hid in the boat, and as Giulia went to complain to Ercole, Luca began looking for a towel to cover Alberto and ended up throwing him into the water by mistake. But Ercole was able to see his tail. As Giulia was shaking the boats of Ercole, Alberto took the opportunity to enter back into the boat, and Luca covered him with a towel, and he quickly turned back to human form. Meanwhile, Luca's parents, Daniela and Lorenzo, are unable to find Luca anywhere, so they decide to go up to the surface to locate him. When they enter the city, they begin splashing water on all of the boys and knocking them into the water in an attempt to find Luca. On their way to Giulia's house, Luca saw his parents knocking children down. Afraid of being discovered by his parents, he went to Alberto to inform him of what he saw. While the three friends were spending time together, Massimo appeared on the scene and asked Alberto to help him, leaving Luca and Giulia alone. They start talking, and Giulia tells him about her school. Realizing that Luca was not educated about the solar system and that he calls the moon and the stars fish, she decides to take him to a telescope on the rooftop and gives him more explanation about the solar system. Seeing his interest in learning new things, she took him to her room and brought out her book, which made him fall in love more with knowledge and want to go to school to study. Luca asked Giulia to borrow him one of her books, but she decided to give it to him as a gift. Suddenly Alberto showed up. He was jealous to see Giulia and Luca getting closer, so he asked his friend for a walk. They took a walk around the city, and Alberto said he had something to show. On the way, Luca began to tell Alberto about his new discoveries and that the stars and moon are balls of fire and not fish, as they thought. But Alberto, being jealous, ignores everything Luca tells him and always changes the subject to his desired scooter. Luca told him that it would be interesting if they paid a visit to Giulia's school to make more discoveries, but Alberto discouraged him, saying he would never be accepted after they discovered he was a monster. Suddenly, Ercole appears in the scene, throwing a harpoon at them. He asked his worshipful followers, Sicchio and Glitto, to get hold of Alberto. He punched him hard, warning the boys to go out of the city. Luca took the harpoon and threatened Ercole, making them release Alberto. They safely arrive at Giulia's house and spend the night there. As the days go by, the friends practice and become better. Every day, Luca practices his cycling, carrying heavy loads around the city without breaking a sweat. Luca and Giulia become closer and study different subjects like astronomy and zoology together, which makes Alberto feel totally left out and extremely jealous. 2 days before the competition, Luca took Alberto and Giulia for a ride to train. When he got to the city center, he saw his parents sitting by the fountain. In an attempt to escape, he took a shortcut ride that took them to the top of a hill. While on top, Giulia showed them the train that usually takes them to school. Hearing about school, Luca asked Giulia whether he could go to school too. Alberto got angry about the idea, and interrupting the conversation, he also asked Luca to go down the hill. But seeing Luca still afraid, he took over the bicycle and began to go down the hill at full speed. He almost collided with the citizens of the city but ended up falling into the sea. Because they don't want to be seen, they sneak into an empty area. Luca was so angry that he began fighting with Alberto as they were about to start fighting. Giulia finally finds them and hugs them. At that moment, Luca asked Giulia whether he could go to school with her. But Alberto, out of jealousy, decides to show himself to her as a monster, trying to make her afraid of both of them. But Luca pretends as though he has nothing to do with sea monsters. They both screamed for help, and Ercole showed up, and Alberto the monster left. When they arrived home, Luca began thinking and panicking about what would have happened to Alberto. Seeing this, Giulia decides to spill water on Luca, exposing him as a sea monster. Giulia sends him away, worried that someone could hurt Luca if his true identity was discovered. Luca decided to return to the island and found the tower destroyed. Luca finds Alberto at the top, extremely upset and sulking. After seeing the destructions in the place, Luca finds marks on the wall and questions Alberto about what the marks mean. Alberto reveals that he made the marks to count the days since his father left him there alone. Still mad at Luca, he asks him to leave and no longer wants to be a part of the competition, but Luca, in an effort to cheer up his friend, decides to return to the city to be part of the competition anyway. On the day of the triathlon, Giulia showed up and was surprised to see Luca, as the race was about to start. Luca arrives wearing an old diving suit and goes to the swimming line. Ercole decides to smear Sicchio with olive oil so that he can dive better in the water and take first place. But in the middle of the water, the fish were attracted to the oil and got hold of the boy's body, forcing him to slow down and take the last place. As they swim, Luca walks under the sea with the diving suit. The pressure ends up breaking the glass, and water leaks through the crack. After he comes out of the water, he hides his face so that no one will see his new appearance, but Ercole causes him to fall and lose his helmet, but he still manages to hide his face. After completing the first challenges successfully, he moved to the eating pasta stage. Luca finds it difficult to use the fork, but Giulia decides to help him. When Sicchio arrives in the last place and Glitto takes his place, Ercole forces him to eat as fast as he can when he finally realizes Giulia has already gone to the bike. After eating, Luca finally entered the cycling stage, the part he has trained the most for. Even though he was using an old bicycle and was behind, Luca managed to overtake all his opponents, taking the first place, even though it was not easy. Unfortunately for Luca, it begins to rain, and Luca tries to avoid being turned back into a sea monster by stopping his bike under an awning. Suddenly Alberto arrives at the scene with an umbrella to help Luca, but when Ercole sees him, he speeds up to him and kicks the boy, causing the umbrella to break into pieces. Alberto gets wet and is transformed back into a sea monster. Seeing that the boy has turned into a monster, Ercole decides to go back and throw a net, trapping him in order to get a reward. Seeing his friend trapped, Luca runs into the rain to save his friend and begins paddling toward them with high speed, transforming into a sea monster. He frees Alberto but also gets transformed. As they are going down the mountain, Ercole starts throwing spears against the boys to eliminate them. But Giulia comes to their rescue, but she ends up hurting herself. She throws herself on Ercole, causing him to fall and break his bike. When they see Giulia on the ground, instead of running away, they decide to turn back to help her. When her father saw them, he immediately takes a spear and runs to them to eliminate them. At that moment, they were surrounded by the crowd, but Massimo, noticing that the monsters were trying to help his daughter and knowing that they were Luca and Alberto, he decided to defend them from the crowd, declaring that the boys are the winners. When the judge examined the result, she said their bike actually crossed the finish line first. Ercole exclaimed that they are not humans and decided to catch them together with the hunters, but seeing Massimo beside them and his size, they backed off. Finally, Luca's parents arrived and were happy to meet Luca. They were so proud to see their boy being rewarded by humans. Everyone in the town of Portorosso sees that the sea monsters are not actually bad, especially Massimo, who thanks the boys for helping his daughter. Luca is reunited with his parents, and they celebrate at Giulia's house. As the holiday came to an end, Giulia decided to go back to school. When they went to the train station to say goodbye to their friend, at that moment, Alberto told Luca that he sold the scooter so he could buy a ticket to Genova for Luca to study. Suddenly, Luca's parents arrive with his belongings, telling him that they have confirmed everything and that he will stay at Giulia's mother's house. Alberto then told Luca that he had decided to stay with Massimo to help him with the fishing. After an emotional farewell, Luca got on the train and went to Genova with Giulia to fulfill his dream of going to school. What did you think of this video? Comment below and make sure you like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this.